Three of the most historic towns in the United States are located on this narrow peninsula in Virginia between the York and James rivers. A visit to Jamestown, Colonial Williamsburg, and Yorktown is a visit to America's beginnings. The three towns are connected by Colonial Parkway. From its west end at Jamestown, the parkway passes along the James, turns inland, and then tunnels under the restored section of Colonial Williamsburg. It continues on through park-like woods and along the York to its western end at Yorktown. Together, the stories of these three towns form a historical continuity. Each one illustrates a specific part of the chronicle which had its beginnings in England nearly 400 years ago. In the reign of Queen Elizabeth during the last half of the 16th century, England became a great European naval power. Elizabeth was called the Virgin Queen, and Virginia was named for her. One of her courtiers, Sir Walter Raleigh, was a driving force behind several early attempts to establish English colonies in the New World. His vision was clear. "I dream," he wrote, "of a new English nation in Virginia." Jamestown was the first permanent English settlement in America, the first phase of Raleigh's dream. Williamsburg was the scene of the full flowering of English-American culture in Virginia. And at Yorktown, the surrender of the British Army under Lord Cornwallis brought about the death of Raleigh's dream. As a community, Jamestown no longer exists. This is where it once stood, now a grassy park on the shore of the James River. You can read about Jamestown in history books and enjoy a pleasant stroll in this place where Englishmen braved the wilderness to establish a new home in the New World. The Jamestown Visitor Center has programs and exhibits that tell the story of the English colony that was founded here so long ago. The striking obelisk nearby was put up in 1907 to commemorate the 300th anniversary of the landing of the first settlers. Fittingly, there's a statue of Captain John Smith, whose strength and wisdom guided the struggling colony in its early years. Not far away is a romanticized statue of Pocahontas, whose friendship for the early settlers helped them in their relations with the Indians. Although no buildings remain from the earliest period, one 17th century structure is still standing here at Jamestown. This is the old church tower, dating from about 1647. Adjacent to the tower is Memorial Church, erected in 1907 on the foundations of two earlier churches. The foundations of a number of ancient buildings have been excavated at Jamestown, but to preserve them, they have been recovered with earth. The modern brickwork you see here outlines the fragile 17th century remains underneath. But relics and monuments sometimes seem impersonal, remote from real flesh and blood people. We need imagination to bring these long-gone people to life, to see buildings rise from ancient ruins. Why did those Englishmen come here? What sort of people were they? What was Jamestown like? What was life like in that far-off world of 1607? King James I succeeded Elizabeth and shared her determination to establish colonies in the New World. But his interest was less in territory than in the riches the new land would supply. In December 1606, 3 small ships left England bound for America. They were the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery. There were 144 men on board. Their adventure was to become one of the supreme achievements in world history, yet they knew almost nothing of what lay ahead. This was not a quest for religious freedom, as it would be for other later settlers farther north. Many of these men believed that in America there would be gold for the gathering, that all the easy wealth of a new and bountiful country would be theirs. The first landing in Virginia was at Cape Henry at the entrance to Chesapeake Bay on April 26, 1607. In the words of one man, their eyes were ravished by the beauty of the new land. They explored both banks of the James River. Were there moments of doubt and fear? Almost certainly. In the back of their minds was the specter of Roanoke, settled 20 years earlier and 100 or so miles farther south. The English settlers there had mysteriously vanished, swallowed up by an inviting but treacherous new continent. At last, on May 13, 1607, a suitable site was found. This was to be the first permanent English settlement in America, the first sure step in the dream of an English America. The place was named Jamestown for King James. Construction of a triangular fort was begun. Trees were felled and trimmed for the high palisade that enclosed it. There was a bastion at each corner where guns from the ships were mounted. Inside, houses, storage shelters, and a church were put up. Since that time, erosion has greatly changed the banks of the James, and the site of that first fort is now believed to be some distance out in the river. Our information about these first settlers is scanty, and the park's interpretive exhibits are based upon only a few facts filled out with reasonable guesses. Continuing research is steadily increasing our knowledge. In 1607, the original inhabitants of Tidewater, Virginia, including the Jamestown area, belonged to a group of Algonquian tribes led by Chief Powhatan. Their country offered good hunting and fishing, and they planted vegetable gardens around their towns. There were frequent wars among the tribes, and Algonquian bows and arrows had developed into powerful and accurate weapons. The English settlers had brought with them a culture worlds away from that of the Indians. Distrust grew on both sides, and conflict was inevitable. In the little band of colonists, one man emerged as a leader, John Smith, explorer, adventurer, mapmaker, and prolific writer. He was a vain and boastful man, but he was of incomparable value to the fledgling colony. The settlers had planted crops as soon as they arrived, but the harvest was inadequate, and Smith secured essential corn and other foods by bartering with the Indians. Later, Smith was captured by another tribe, and according to his own story, was saved from execution by an Indian girl named Pocahontas, daughter of Chief Powhatan. At the fort, misfortunes multiplied. Provisions spoiled and drinking water turned brackish. Mosquitoes bred in the nearby swamps, and the settlement was ravaged by fevers. By the end of 1607, half of the original 104 settlers had died. Then, soon after the arrival of the first supply ships from England early in 1608, disaster struck. Fire swept the fort, and homes and vital supplies were lost. Somehow the men found the strength and heart to rebuild and to plant new crops. The young corn flourished, and with the arrival of fresh supplies and more settlers, the spirit of the colony revived. A few tentative efforts were even made at starting industries, including the making of glass. Near the ruins of the original glass-making furnaces of 1608, a 17th century glass house has been recreated, where modern visitors can see authentic glass-blowing techniques in living history demonstrations. A variety of different items are produced for sale, similar to those made 350 years ago. Fragments excavated at the original site suggest that window glass, bottles of various sizes, and plain drinking glasses were made in the early years at Jamestown. Although glassmaking was eventually discontinued here, it's among the oldest of all American industries. As the winter of 1609-10 approached, still more calamities befell the struggling colony. Crops failed, supplies dwindled, and the people were forced to scavenge for food. This dreadful period became known as the starving time. Increasingly, force had been used against the Indians, and at last they retaliated. It was no longer safe to go outside the palisade. Disease again devastated the colony. By spring, all hope was gone. Raleigh's splendid dream was dead. The place that first had seemed so fair had become a horror. Before this malevolent country could claim them, as it had the Englishmen at Roanoke, the survivors of Jamestown decided to abandon it. They went on board the ships and sailed downriver, bound for England, bound for home. Then, in an astonishing coincidence, before they had reached the Chesapeake, they met a fleet of supply ships. Destiny had smiled, and Jamestown was saved. Soon, more ships and settlers arrived. Other plantations were begun, upriver and down. Probably for the first time, there must have been a feeling of permanence in Jamestown. The tobacco plant grew wild in Virginia and had been used by the Indians for centuries. But the smoke did not please English tastes until John Rolfe developed a new variety and a new method of curing it. In 1617, the colony exported 20,000 pounds of the weed. Soon, nearly every householder grew some tobacco along with the family vegetables and hung the leaves indoors to dry. For a few, tobacco became the ladder to wealth. Its cultivation laid the foundations for the vast plantations of a later era, which would be based upon slave labor and rich golden leaves. For the settlements along the James, this new industry meant salvation. Trade flourished, and more English men and women determined to make Virginia their home. The New World had indeed provided the gold that the first settlers had hoped for so desperately. Pocahontas, Chief Powhatan's daughter, befriended the settlers and married John Rolfe. She adopted English dress, and eventually she and her husband journeyed to England. Jamestown, located at the edge of an apparently limitless new continent, had become a thriving settlement, capital of the new English nation in Virginia, of Raleigh's dream. As the colony grew, its government needed reorganization. In 1619, in the Jamestown Church, which stood near where the old church tower is now, Governor Sir George Yardley convened the first representative legislative assembly in the New World. Our state legislatures and our federal Congress are directly descended from this earliest assembly at Jamestown. A pottery kiln has been excavated at Jamestown dating from about 1625 to 1640. Near it were fragments of everyday earthenware utensils such as mugs and bowls and pots. The craft of pottery making has been renewed here, using modern adaptations of many 17th century techniques. Visitors can watch the entire pottery making process, starting when the potter first kneads the lump of clay. Although the glaze on colonial pottery contained lead, the attractive items produced here today are lead-free. Designs and decorations are based on authentic styles of the period. By the middle of the century, in spite of Indian attacks, fires, recurrent sicknesses, and the general unhealthfulness of the site, Jamestown was flourishing. This yeoman's house reflects the prosperity of a typical small landholder. There was even the 17th century equivalent of a row house, with homes for several families. Here at Jamestown, at least, the wilderness was in retreat, and few could now doubt that the new English nation in Virginia was permanent and prospering. Adjacent to the original site of historic Jamestown, which is administered by the National Park Service and the Association for the Preservation of Virginia Antiquities, is Jamestown Festival Park, operated by the Commonwealth of Virginia. Here at Festival Park, there are reproductions of several typical structures of a Powhatan Indian village. And facing the river, there's a conjectural replica of the first fort built at Jamestown. Inside are a church, a guardhouse, and 15 houses. Probably the star attractions at the Festival Park are the speculative reproductions of the 3 ships based on ship designs of the period. You can see the Susan Constant, the Discovery, and the Godspeed. These aren't models. They're full-scale sailing vessels. As the end of the 17th century approached, Jamestown had survived more than its share of crises, even a rebellion of frontier landholders who burned the town. Jamestown was rebuilt, but its destruction may have focused attention on the fact that its unhealthful location made it unsuitable as the capital of a large and growing colony. The final blow fell in 1698 when the new State House accidentally burned. It was decided to move the seat of government 8 miles northeast to a town called Middle Plantation. Today there's a slightly mysterious aura about the place where Jamestown used to be. So little seems to remain from those early times. There are relatively few physical remains, it's true, and those are mostly fragments. But Jamestown was the capital of the colony of Virginia for over 90 years. This is where America began. Virginia and all the United States are the legacies it left to the future. Middle Plantation, soon renamed Williamsburg, was a small settlement when Virginia's capital was moved here in 1699. However, it was the home of the College of William and Mary, founded 6 years earlier. That important institution was the center of higher education in Virginia. While a new Capitol building was being built, the Colonial Assembly met here at the college. The new capital city, however, did not yet reflect Virginia's growing importance. The governor conceived a far grander municipality, and he superimposed his innovative plan on the existing village. The college would now dominate the west end of a new broad main street named Duke of Gloucester. About a mile away at the east end, the colony's handsome new Capitol building was under construction. Between the two stood Bruton Parish Church. Near it was the large grassy area of Market Square. Then, north of the church, situated commandingly at the end of a long open green, would be the governor's mansion, or palace as it came to be called, sufficiently opulent to reflect the dignity of the office. By the early 1720s, all of these public buildings were substantially complete. The Colonial Assembly now deliberated in the Capitol. This body was a direct descendant of the first assembly at Jamestown, created a century earlier. The congregation of Bruton Parish had grown larger as the city expanded. With the governor's palace, the colony of Virginia had a public building that was as splendid as any on the continent. These structures symbolized a new beginning for Williamsburg, and indeed for the entire colony. The city developed during the next half-century into a stage where world-shaking events took place. The number and variety of artisans, skilled workers who specialized in a trade, increased as Williamsburg grew, and soon the town was able to produce most of the basic necessities of food, clothing, and shelter. Williamsburg developed as Jamestown never had, and while that little village on the James River, the historic first English settlement in America, slipped into oblivion, the new capital flourished. Even though Virginia's capital was later moved once again, Williamsburg, by great good fortune, did not fade away and die. It kept abreast of changing times and continued on into the 20th century as a college town and a bustling county seat. The reasons why it didn't suffer the sad fate that befell Jamestown are unique in American history. In the 1920s, Reverend W.A.R. Goodwin, rector of Bruton Parish Church, realized that Williamsburg's colonial buildings were fast disappearing thanks to the rise of the automobile and the consequent modernization of the town. Many old structures were masked by alterations. Others had deteriorated and some had been destroyed. But Reverend Goodwin was able to visualize the grandeur that was Williamsburg, and he dreamed of the possibility of restoring the city to its long-gone splendor. He described his dream to John D. Rockefeller, Jr. The town's architectural heritage from the 18th century, he pointed out, was being lost, and it was a treasure of national significance. Mr. Rockefeller saw an unprecedented opportunity to recreate a community where modern Americans would be able to learn what life was like during an important period in their country's history. He resolved to undertake Reverend Goodwin's extraordinary vision. The work was begun in 1926. When possible, modern buildings were moved outside the area to be restored. Many recent structures had to be destroyed so that colonial buildings could be reconstructed on their original sites. The Brush Everard House was a good example of an 18th century home that had undergone many later alterations. Before its restoration was begun, every feature of its construction and decoration was studied, inside and out. modern cement was removed and replaced with an 18th century type of mortar, made with lime from burned oyster shells. Layers of paint were peeled away so the original colors could be determined. At last, the Brush Everard House was complete, fully and authentically restored to its 18th century beauty. Work was infinitely more complex when the original 18th century structure had disappeared. Both the Capitol and the Palace, for example, Williamsburg's two most important buildings, had burned long before. Documentary research alone was not enough. Sites were surveyed. Archaeological techniques were used to uncover long-buried foundations. Even small fragments offered clues to building details. One historical item in the library of the college proved to be of incalculable value. It's known as the Frenchman's Map, drawn by a French officer in 1782. It locates the streets and many of the buildings of Williamsburg at that time. This carefully detailed manuscript came to be called the Bible of the Restoration. Another great stroke of luck in the Restoration story occurred in the Bodleian Library of Oxford University in England. Mary Goodwin, Reverend Goodwin's cousin, and her associate Miss Cannon, discovered an engraved plate made for an 18th century book. On it were drawings of the Capitol, the Palace, and the college, showing them as they actually looked during the city's golden era. For more than 30 years, Mr. Rockefeller provided funds to acquire 18th century sites and to restore or reconstruct the buildings of Colonial Williamsburg. He and Mrs. Rockefeller, when they were here, made their home in Bassett Hall, an 18th century frame house set in lovely grounds. It was furnished by the Rockefellers with antiques and fine examples of American folk art, and is now open to the public. Carter's Grove, another 18th century house in a very different style, is located on the James River about 8 miles from Williamsburg. This stately mansion was built by a wealthy planter named Carter Burwell. On its grounds, the long-buried remains of an early 17th century village have been discovered. This ancient community was called Wolstenholme Town, settled only a few years after Jamestown. The locations of the town's original palisade and other structures have been marked with modern constructions. Today, the historic area of Colonial Williamsburg covers about 175 acres. It's a recreation on an unprecedented scale of a special time and place. 88 original structures from the late 18th and early 19th centuries have been restored to their former appearance. After extensive research, nearly 100 large buildings and several hundred smaller structures have been authentically reconstructed on their original sites. The palace and the Capitol are as imposing now as they were over 2 centuries ago, and today's visitors are able to see them as colonial Americans saw them. Bruton Parish Church is still an active church and has been since 1715. Some of the flat grave markers in the church cemetery were imported from England, and a few have genuinely startling decorations. Many 18th century gardens have been recreated in Williamsburg, using the designs and even the plants that the colonists were acquainted with. This famous garden copies the pattern of the Union Jack. Visitors to Colonial Williamsburg, after they've appreciated the scope of the restoration, can go on to make some general observations about it. For one, everything is superbly maintained. The attention that's been given to historic detail is astounding. No particular, however commonplace, has been neglected in presenting an authentic picture of Virginia's colonial capital. And this is not just a superficial alteration of old structures. Many buildings are fully furnished and open to visitors. Several 18th century shops and taverns serve the public now as they did in colonial times. In addition, a variety of craftsmen work here, using 18th century tools and 18th century methods to create the products of the period. Colonial Williamsburg has marvelous depth. The town is three-dimensional, as all real towns are. But as any visitor knows, Colonial Williamsburg is not just a history lesson. The place is fun to visit, no matter how old or young you are. You can spend your time in the popular places on Duke of Gloucester Street, or find a less busy spot for a quiet walk. Most of all, you can see and do things here that are far from your everyday experiences.
Loaded with cartridges. A paper cartridge, which contained inside at the bottom a round ball. Above it, a charge of gunpowder. And a little bit of the powder went right there. That's the priming. The cartridge simply inserted. A ramrod used then to seat powder, bullet, paper wad with one motion. The gun brought up and cocked, and it was ready to fire.
Everyone's tour should start at the Visitor Center, gateway to Colonial Williamsburg. There are programs here to introduce newcomers to the town, and you can make reservations for lodging and dining. Motor vehicles are banned from the historic area during daylight hours, so visitors leave their cars here and ride the Colonial Williamsburg buses. The Williamsburg Inn, one of America's most distinguished hotels, is located adjacent to the historic area. Other accommodations are available nearby. At the college end of Duke of Gloucester Street, in the blocks known as Merchant Square, there's a variety of fine shops and eating establishments. From the very beginning, entertainments, celebrations, and militia musters have been held in Market Square. These were among the most thrilling times for anyone to be in Williamsburg, and this is still true today.
Battalion, fix your bayonet! Battalion, charge your bayonet!
By the middle of the 18th century, Williamsburg had grown into a very cosmopolitan city, crown jewel of the English nation of Raleigh's dream. And thanks primarily to tobacco, Virginia's economy was flourishing. Now, luxury items were created by the artisans at Williamsburg. These, as well as rich imported products, found a ready local market. Many people enjoyed the luxury of more leisure time, too. Raleigh Tavern was popular with visitors and townsfolk alike. Here, besides meals and lodging, one could find a convivial game of billiards. In the Apollo Room, there might even be a lively dance. Thomas Jefferson entered the College of William and Mary in 1760. He left after 2 years and later studied law under George Wythe, a widely known lawyer who represented Williamsburg in the House of Burgesses. The Burgesses were soon occupied with a Stamp Act, passed by the English Parliament in London, levying taxes on the American colonies. Patrick Henry, in a fiery speech before the Burgesses, asserted that the Virginia Assembly alone had the power to tax Virginians. A resolution to that effect was adopted. Virginia's Stamp Act resolution was sent to the other colonies, and Americans grumbled increasingly about Parliament's interference in American affairs. Many colonists began to think about defending themselves against their mother country. The military aspects of the militia musters in Market Square gradually took on more significance. In 1773, colonists in Massachusetts dumped a cargo of tea into Boston Harbor to protest a new tea tax, and Parliament shut down the port. In sympathy, the Virginia Burgesses assembled at Bruton Parish Church, holding a day of prayer and fasting. To chastise these men, the colony's leading citizens, Virginia's royal governor, Lord Dunmore, promptly dissolved the assembly. The Burgesses then met in Raleigh Tavern and circulated a proposal to all the other colonies to meet and confer on united resistance. The result was the First Continental Congress, which met at Philadelphia in the fall of 1774. Peyton Randolph of Williamsburg was elected to preside, and a petition was dispatched to King George III protesting taxation without representation, the dissolution of colonial assemblies, and other parliamentary oppressions. The Virginia Assembly passed an act to train a standing militia. Governor Dunmore ordered British Marines to remove the town's gunpowder from the magazine. Patrick Henry, leading a band of armed patriots, demanded that Lord Dunmore return the powder or pay for it. But cooler heads prevailed, and a compromise was worked out. Then, a few days later, news reached Williamsburg of the skirmishes at Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts. War with Great Britain had begun. The Second Continental Congress convened in the Pennsylvania State House, now Independence Hall in Philadelphia, on May 10, 1775. Virginia's George Washington was chosen Commander-in-Chief of the Patriot, or Continental, Army, which was still unorganized and untrained. In June 1776, Congress appointed a committee to draft a document to justify both the rebellion and the determination of the American people to secure their independence. The Declaration of Independence was composed principally by Thomas Jefferson in his rented rooms in Philadelphia. His eloquent statement of basic human rights thrilled the citizens of Williamsburg when it was read to them, just as it still stirs our hearts today. In general, the war went badly for Americans until the fall of 1777, when the victory of General Horatio Gates at Saratoga changed the course of history. The date is significant, October 17, 1777. With the surrender of British General John Burgoyne and his entire army, Americans proved their abilities on the battlefield. The triumph at Saratoga helped to induce King Louis XVI of France to bring his powerful military and naval forces into the war on the side of the United States. Now perhaps freedom and independence might be possible after all. Meanwhile, in Virginia, the area of settlement had expanded westward, and Williamsburg was now far from the center of population. At last, in 1780, for this and other reasons, Virginia's capital was moved again, this last time to Richmond. But the historic peninsula between the James and York rivers, where America began, was to have one more brilliant moment of glory, when the vicissitudes of war focused the military strategy of both sides on Yorktown. The magical name Yorktown immediately brings to mind the surrender of a large British army, the great victory for America and her ally France that assured the independence of the United States. The surrender ceremony took place on this green and pleasant field, October 19th, 1781. Today, near the field, there's a display of captured British cannon. The guns have triumphant American inscriptions added after their capture. Yorktown and its river are no longer the busy seaport they were in the middle of the 18th century. The population now is smaller, and tourism has become an important industry. The town still has a strong sense of its history, and a number of colonial buildings have been restored or reconstructed by the National Park Service. The Yorktown Victory Monument here commemorates America's alliance with France and the surrender of the British Army under Lord Cornwallis, which effectually ended the American War for Independence. The cornerstone of the monument was laid in 1881 at the centennial celebration. Near the town, just inside the old British defense line, is the National Park Service Visitor Center. Besides the displays and audiovisual programs that help to interpret the Yorktown battle, visitors can see 18th century artifacts that have been unearthed on the battlefield. Many exhibits naturally relate to warfare, but there are also some less martial items of great interest. Among the more spectacular exhibits are the sleeping tents used by George Washington in the Yorktown campaign, and part of a reconstructed British frigate containing naval items recovered from the York River. The battlefield has changed since the 18th century. During the Civil War, Confederate soldiers dug earthworks where the old British lines of 1781 had been. Parts of the American and French lines, however, have been reconstructed. Ranger-guided tours are regularly scheduled. The many interpretive presentations and the carefully restored colonial buildings at Yorktown all contribute to an image of a distant era, the era that saw the end of Sir Walter Raleigh's new English nation in Virginia. Here at Yorktown, the English dream died, and the American dream became reality. Yorktown was established near the end of the 17th century as a tobacco port, a few miles up the York River from Chesapeake Bay. Grace Church, whose sturdy walls have survived fire and siege, dates from around 1697. It still serves its congregation today. Mungo Somerwell, a local ferryman, built this pleasant home before 1707. Swan Tavern, now reconstructed on its original foundations, began serving patrons in 1722 and became the most well-known tavern in town. The Nelson House, showplace of colonial Yorktown, has been faithfully restored. At the time of the siege, its owner was Thomas Nelson, Jr., the town's most prominent citizen, then governor of Virginia and a signer of the Declaration of Independence. The house was badly scarred in the siege of 1781. Affluent merchants built their fine homes on the bluffs above the river. Warehouses, shops, and a few modest dwellings like the Archer House were clustered along the waterfront. Yorktown reached its peak of prosperity about 1750. Croplands in the river basin were becoming exhausted, and Virginia's tobacco economy moved elsewhere. The town entered onto a slow decline. But how did it happen that the climactic battle of the American Revolution took place here, in a small, comparatively insignificant seaport far from the major theaters of war? The key word in the question is seaport. Midsummer 1781, General Charles Cornwallis, with an army of British veterans and German mercenaries, was ordered to seize and fortify a seaport on the Chesapeake for use as a British naval base. Cornwallis chose Yorktown, moved his entire army here, and began to build fortifications. He felt no urgency since he expected reinforcements and a British fleet any day. But he had placed his army in a potential trap. A sufficiently large American and French force could easily cut off all supply and escape routes by land. Unless the British controlled the Chesapeake, and until their fleet arrived they did not, French warships could cut off Cornwallis's supply or escape by sea. If those conditions were met, his army would be doomed. The Marquis de Lafayette, a young French nobleman passionately devoted to America, commanded a small American force in Virginia that was trying to hold Cornwallis where he was. Lafayette had written General Washington, then outside New York City with the main American army, of Cornwallis's situation. Washington also learned that French Admiral de Grasse would soon reach the Chesapeake with a powerful fleet bringing troops and artillery. This sudden superiority of Allied strength in Virginia made an operation there seem extraordinarily worthwhile. Washington combined most of his army with the French forces of General Rochambeau and sent them on the long journey toward Virginia to join Lafayette. If the ships of Admiral de Grasse could operate in conjunction with these Allied land forces, Cornwallis's army at Yorktown might indeed be put in jeopardy. The French fleet reached the Chesapeake at the end of August and immediately blockaded the mouth of the bay. The British army was now cut off from help by sea. On the 5th of September, the expected British fleet under Admiral Thomas Graves was sighted off the Virginia Capes. De Grasse, leaving enough vessels to maintain the blockade, led his remaining warships out to meet the British. No American vessels took part in the battle off the Virginia Capes. Yet its outcome decided the fate of the young United States. Admiral Graves fired first. Admiral de Grasse, on board the Ville de Paris, mightiest warship in the world, maneuvered to meet the enemy line. The British closed, and soon the lead ships of both squadrons were firing broadsides at almost musket range. Cannon fire ended near evening and fighting was not resumed the next day. No ships were sunk during the battle, but damage was severe on both sides. The British fleet was so badly shattered that it limped back to New York for repairs. There, public sentiment was not poor Admiral Graves, but poor Cornwallis. The French had won a magnificent victory. The Chesapeake now belonged to the Allies, and Cornwallis's prospects began to look grim. Today's visitors might pause while touring Yorktown and its battlefield and remember that during the siege of 1781, this quiet community, this gentle landscape, shook with the thunder of cannon and shell. Many men of many nationalities were wounded and killed. Here, in what is now a peaceful, shady grove of trees, General Washington set up his headquarters and planned the strategy that led to victory. Superior numbers of men and cannon contributed, of course, but it was men and cannon ideally deployed that created the Allied triumph. After the British fleet had been driven off, Allied land forces continued to mass for the assault on Cornwallis. On September 14th, Washington and Rochambeau rode into Williamsburg. The local artillery fired a thunderous salute. Washington made his headquarters here in the home of George Wythe. The Allied armies moved on Yorktown and, meeting no resistance, took up their positions around the town. Before the end of September, all was ready. After studying the situation, Washington decided not to make a direct attack, but to open a siege instead. The British defense line circled around the outskirts of the town, and the Allies dug their entrenchments 600 to 800 yards outside the British positions. Allied artillery was hauled up, and on October 9th, the bombardment of the town and the British defenses began. General Washington himself touched off the first cannon fired by the Americans. Governor Nelson suggested his own home as a target for the gunners, pointing out that Cornwallis might well be using it for his headquarters. Allied fire on the town and the British lines grew in intensity. The fury of the bombardment continued night and day. Cornwallis's gunners returned the fire. The effects of the Allied siege artillery were devastating. There's a local tradition that Cornwallis directed his operations from the shelter of a cave in the bluff. The cave still bears his name. The Allies began a second siege line, closer yet to the enemy's defenses. However, the new works could not be completed until two major British strongpoints, redoubts 9 and 10, were captured. Separate attacks were launched on the night of October 14th. French soldiers struck number 9. Alexander Hamilton led the American assault on redoubt number 10. After ferocious hand-to-hand fighting, American and French flags were planted on the parapets, and work on the vital second siege line could continue. When British hopes were all but gone, Cornwallis tried a desperate escape. The plan was to ferry his army across the York River to Gloucester Point. After dark on October 16th, the first third of his troops were taken over. As the transports returned for more men, a violent squall roared out of the west, scattered the boats, and made further crossings impossible. Now, all escape routes were sealed shut. The next day, Cornwallis brought back the 1st Division to face the inevitable with their comrades. One of his officers wrote, "Thus expired the last hope of the British Army." During that same stormy night, the Allies had also been busy. Daylight on the 17th revealed their completed second siege line between redoubts 9 and 10. Here, the Americans massed their greatest concentration of artillery, now within point-blank range of the British defenses. On October 17, 1781, General Cornwallis sent a flag of truce to General Washington proposing terms of surrender. It was 4 years to the day after the surrender of Burgoyne at Saratoga, the American victory that had made possible the alliance with France. Two commissioners from each side met in the neat frame house of Augustine Moore, well outside the Allied lines. Negotiations were conducted in this room. The Americans, remembering earlier humiliations at the hands of their enemies, set harsh terms, but the British had no choice. Their ammunition was nearly gone, rations were short, and the stress of the bombardment had been appalling. The surrender document was completed at last, and Cornwallis signed it the next morning. The surrender ceremony took place on the afternoon of October 19, 1781, on a broad, grassy field about 1.5 miles south of Yorktown. Civilians flocked to the site. General Cornwallis's army marched onto the field with flags covered. American soldiers, some smiling in victory, lined one side of the route. French soldiers, the other. The British band is said to have played a strange little song called "The World Turned Upside Down." If buttercups now buzzed after the bee, if boats were on land, churches on sea, summer were spring and the t'other way round, then all the world would be upside down. General Cornwallis was not present. He sent word that he was indisposed. His second-in-command attempted to surrender to General Rochambeau rather than to an American, but he was directed to General Washington, who turned him over to his second-in-command. British and German soldiers laid down their arms in a formal acknowledgement of defeat. Later, when the British Prime Minister heard of the surrender at Yorktown, he exclaimed, "Oh God, it's all over." And indeed, that proved to be the case. Great Britain had lost the colonies. For most Americans, the war ended here, although Britain did not recognize American independence until the Treaty of Peace was signed nearly 2 years later. The surrender ceremony at Yorktown was the funeral rite for Raleigh's glorious English dream. Today, more than 2 centuries after Yorktown, ancient antagonisms are long forgotten. The United States and Great Britain are linked by a staunch friendship that is one of the bulwarks of the free world. We, the British and the Americans, like to call each other cousins, and so we are. In language and in many of our laws, customs, and political ideals, our two nations share a common heritage, with roots that go far back to the birth of England. In these respects, perhaps, Raleigh's dream of a new English nation in Virginia has partially come true. But after Yorktown, it became clear that it was an American nation that began at Jamestown and flourished at Williamsburg. A nation whose origins are forever English, with a present and future that are uniquely American.